Non-market benefits are benefits generated by goods that are not bought and sold in markets. Examples could include enhanced ecological conditions, improved aesthetic conditions, or improved public health. These benefits are unpriced, there isn't a price attached to them, you can't buy them in a market, but they're still very valuable. The theory behind the estimation of consumer surplus that applied to market goods is also relevant to non-market goods. The consumers, in quotes, of non-market benefits have a willingness to pay for the good. And if the willingness to pay is greater than what they actually have to pay, which might be zero in the case of some environmental benefits, the difference is their consumer surplus, which is what we need to know to include in the benefit cost analysis. Why are these goods unpriced? Well, there's several possible reasons. One is that it may not be physically possible to charge a price. An example here would be existence values. An example of an existence value is that I feel happy to know that the humpback whale population in Australia has partially recovered. But you can't charge me a price for that benefit. I'm going to get that benefit whether or not you allow me to. You can't stop me as long as the whales exist. Another possible reason is that it's not socially possible to charge a price. It's just not socially acceptable. The social norm is that the good is free. And so as a result, there's no legal basis for pricing. Examples here could include water in some countries where water is provided for free, or access to public parks. In these cases, nobody has sufficient property rights over these goods to be able to sell them. A third reason is that it could be too expensive to monitor or control people from benefiting from the good. An example could be a reduction in air pollution in a city where there are millions of people who are affected, and rather than individually buy and sell rights to clean air, what governments usually do is regulate polluters to benefit everybody. Estimating non-market values requires information on a few different things. One is that you need to know the additional quantity of the benefit that results from the project. For example, a project might reduce the probability of extinction of a particular species within 50 years from 0.5 or 50% down to 0.1 or 10%. This information could be sourced from research or modelling, or from experts making judgments, from previous experience, and so on. As well as that though, you need to be able to quantify the monetary equivalent value of that additional quantity of the benefit. And that could be expressed per person, or per household, or some other unit. And you need to get these from non-market valuation studies. And then you need to know how many people, or how many households, or how many units of whatever unit you're using will have access to the benefit. The total value of the benefit will be the average willingness to pay per person or per household, times the number of people, or perhaps per households. And when I say the average willingness to pay, that average represents a range. The reality is that there's diversity in the community in their willingness to pay for anything. Now, sometimes it's possible to identify different willingness to pay levels for different groups in society. You may be able to break it down into different groups, in which case you can weight the willingness to pay by the size of the groups to get an aggregate willingness to pay for each group, and then add them up. We need non-market values for a range of things. We need them to prioritise amongst competing environmental and social projects, which is what we're really talking about in this case. We need them to properly consider the trade-offs between environmental or social outcomes and other types of outcomes, such as perhaps economic development. We need them to make a case for public investment in environmental or social projects. And in some countries, they may be valuable to help determine legal liability for breaches of law, such as environmental laws. How do we estimate these non-market values? Well, there's a couple of main groups of ways. I'm not going to talk about these ways in detail, but in general, one option is to observe people's behaviour, which we call revealed preference. They're revealing their preferences by their behaviour. And there's two main methods here. There's hedonic pricing and there's travel cost. An example for hedonic pricing is that an environmental factor, such as proximity to a river, influences the price that's paid for a house. And we can use statistics then to unpack how much of the house price is due to this environmental factor and use that as our measure of the benefits of the environmental factor. In travel cost, we can correlate the usage of an environmental resource with the cost of accessing it, including the travel costs and the time required. And that gives us the equivalent of a demand curve, which we can use to estimate the consumer surplus. The other broad approach is to survey people, which we go under the label of stated preference because people state what their preferences are. So here we ask people one of two things. We either ask them their willingness to pay for an environmental or social benefit using a technique called contingent valuation, or we ask them their willingness to trade off different outcomes, including environmental or social outcomes, using a technique called choice experiments or sometimes choice modelling. There are many thousands of existing non-market valuation studies that we can draw on to obtain estimates of these values. And these are available for many issues in many locations, particularly for environmental issues. Although it can still be hard sometimes to find just the right study for your project that you're trying to evaluate. So what can you do? If there's no study available that just suits your issue, you can conduct an original study. You can extrapolate from past studies with adjustments. You can do a meta-analysis across a range of studies. Or sometimes you can use an accepted value. For something like the value of a statistical life, the government recommends a national value that we should use for that. Some issues that I've not discussed in this video are how to make these different techniques work. I don't have time to do that. I haven't talked about which specific types of benefits they cover. I haven't talked about some of the criticisms of the general idea of estimating non-market values, and I haven't provided replies to those criticisms. Key points. Many environmental and social benefits from projects or policies are non-market benefits. For these, we cannot observe a market demand curve, so it becomes a bit harder to estimate consumer surplus. However, it's still important to estimate these non-market values to do justice to these projects and policies that generate these benefits. I've talked about various methods of doing so and told you that there's quite a lot of evidence about the different types of non-market values that might be relevant to your projects.